When peace shatters, empires burn. Genius, loyalty, betrayal. The year is 540 AD. From the marble halls of Constantinople to the scorched plains of Mesopotamia, a shadow creeps across the Eastern Roman Empire. The Treaty of Eternal Peace, signed less than a decade earlier, lies in ruins. From the east, the banners of Khosrow I rise like a tide of fire. His cavalry sweeps across Roman lands, burning, pillaging, leaving behind cities as silent graveyards. And then, the unthinkable happens. Antioch falls. One of the crown jewels of the empire, a city of scholars and merchants, reduced to smoke and rubble. Its people dragged into captivity, its treasures carted away as trophies. In the heart of this chaos, one name is whispered both in hope and in fear: Belisarius, the man who once humbled the Vandals, who stood as a wall against the Gothic tide in Italy. But now, the stakes are different. He is not just facing armies. He is facing a crumbling empire, political intrigue, and an emperor who may not truly trust him. As the fires of war rage, another threat brews silently, one that no sword can strike down and no fortress can withstand. Soon it will consume not only armies, but the very soul of the empire. This is the story of a commander's brilliance and betrayal, of victories overshadowed by whispers in the corridors of power, of a man who could save an empire, if only the empire would let him. If you were an emperor, would you trust a general whose victories made him more beloved than you? 9 years before the fires of Antioch, Rome and Persia had signed what they called the Treaty of Eternal Peace. It was meant to halt centuries of conflict. Two ancient empires weary from bleeding each other dry. For a time, the eastern frontier was quiet. Trade resumed, cities rebuilt, and Justinian turned his gaze westward, dreaming of restoring the glory of the old Roman world. But peace in the ancient world was rarely eternal. In the east, Khosrow I sat upon the Sassanid throne, a ruler as ambitious as Justinian himself. To him, the treaty was not sacred scripture, but a convenience, one he would abandon the moment it suited him. Justinian's attention was consumed by costly wars in Italy and North Africa. His coffers bled gold, his armies stretched thin, and his generals scattered across distant fronts. Khosrow saw opportunity in Justinian's overreach. Beyond mere conquest, he sought to send a message that Persia was Rome's equal, perhaps even its master. His campaign would not just take cities, it would humiliate the empire in the eyes of the world. The sack of Antioch was not only a military victory, it was a symbolic act calculated to break Roman morale. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the emperor's council was fractured. The treasury groaned under the weight of war expenses. Tax revolts simmered in the provinces, and the grain supply from Egypt was vulnerable. Justinian's grand vision of a united Roman world was beginning to look less like destiny and more like hubris. It is in this crucible of political strain, military overextension, and personal ambition that the stage was set for Belisarius's return to the Eastern Front. But this time, he would not be riding out with the full strength of the empire at his back. His victories would have to be forged under the shadow of imperial doubt and a storm of enemies, both without and within. Do you think Khosrow struck because he saw Justinian's weakness, or because he simply could not resist testing Rome's pride? If you were Justinian, would you have pulled Belisarius from the Italian campaign earlier to protect the East? The year 540 AD erupted into chaos. Without a formal declaration, Khosrow I crossed the frontier with a force the likes of which the eastern Roman provinces had not seen in decades. This was no simple raid. It was a calculated storm. City after city fell beneath the Sassanid advance. Dara, the great frontier fortress, was bypassed. Khosrow struck deep, avoiding prolonged sieges, moving with a speed that left Roman garrisons scrambling. Callinicum, Apamea, and smaller towns along the Euphrates were stripped of wealth and population. Fields burned in the spring sun. Refugees flooded the roads to Antioch, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. And then came the jewel of Syria, Antioch. Once a city of 500,000 souls, Antioch stood as a beacon of Hellenistic culture, Roman administration, and Christian devotion. Its walls had withstood centuries of strife, but this time the defense was thin. Justinian's best legions were still bogged down in Italy. What forces remained in the east were scattered, uncoordinated. Khosrow breached the city's defenses, and in a matter of days, Antioch was transformed into a vision of hell. Smoke choked the air, marble temples blackened with soot, the famed colonnades reduced to rubble. Thousands were slaughtered. Tens of thousands more were marched away in chains, destined for Persian captivity. The looting was meticulous, treasures carted back to Ctesiphon to be displayed as symbols of Rome's humiliation. In Constantinople, the news landed like a dagger. Justinian could no longer ignore the Eastern Front, but the empire's strength was fractured. He needed a commander whose name alone could rally troops and strike fear into the enemy. There was only one choice: Belisarius. The summons was swift. Fresh from the grinding war against the Goths, Belisarius was ordered east. Yet, unlike his earlier campaigns, he would not march with overwhelming force. Supplies were limited, manpower scarce, and his orders came wrapped in layers of imperial caution. Victory was demanded, but Belisarius was to achieve it with the barest means. The war had begun not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who would fight it. For Belisarius, this was not simply another campaign. It was a test of loyalty, strategy, and survival, against enemies both in the field and behind the palace walls. If you were in Belisarius's place, would you take on the mission knowing the emperor was giving you too few resources? Was the fall of Antioch inevitable, or could a better prepared defense have stopped Khosrow's advance? Belisarius arrived in the east to find not an army, but a scattering of units. Weary frontier soldiers, understrength cavalry detachments, and hastily levied local militias. The great imperial machine he had commanded in Africa and Italy was absent. This was a patchwork force, barely held together by his reputation. From the start, the strategic situation was dire. The Sassanids had withdrawn much of their main force after the sack of Antioch, but Khosrow had left garrisons in key fortresses and could return at will. Belisarius knew he had to strike quickly. not to destroy the Persians outright. That was impossible with his numbers, but to show strength, disrupt their supply lines, and reassure the terrified provinces. His first major move was the Nisibis operation. Nisibis, a heavily fortified Persian stronghold, had long been the thorn in Rome's eastern flank. A direct assault would be suicide, so Belisarius employed deception. He advanced with enough force to suggest a siege, drawing Persian troops to defend it, while covertly sending cavalry to raid deep into their territory. The ploy disrupted Persian communications, but without siege engines or sustained manpower, Nisibis itself remained untaken. From there, Belisarius turned to Sisauranon, another fortified town under Persian control. This time, a combination of surprise and negotiation worked in his favor. His agents persuaded the local garrison commander, a man disillusioned with Khosrow's rule, to surrender the fortress in exchange for safe passage. The capture of Sisauranon was a rare victory, a flicker of hope amid grim realities. Yet each success came at a price. The army's numbers dwindled with every skirmish, disease crept through the camps, and supply shortages became routine. The eastern provinces, already stripped by Khosrow's earlier raids, could not feed a long campaign. Worse still, political cracks began to show. Some of Justinian's envoys questioned Belisarius's loyalty, whispering to Constantinople that his fame had grown too great. Orders from the capital were vague, sometimes contradictory, a sign that the emperor's trust was not absolute. Among his officers, rivalries flared. A few openly resented serving under a general whose victories they believed were overglorified. Belisarius pressed on, aware that each day of campaigning was also a day in which political knives were being sharpened behind his back. His challenge was no longer just to win on the battlefield, but to keep his command intact in the face of both exhaustion and intrigue. By the spring of 542, his preparations for a renewed offensive were nearly complete. Morale, though strained, was holding. The Persians had been kept off balance, but in the east, fate often moves in unseen ways, and an enemy far more insidious than the Sassanid army was already stirring. The stage was set for a catastrophe no general could have planned for. Do you think Belisarius's use of deception at Nisibis was the right choice, or should he have risked a direct siege? Could the political intrigues in Constantinople have been more dangerous to Belisarius than the Persian army itself?